Hello, this is 3D Modeling and Rendering 1, Week 1. This is the intro to the class video that I give. It's sort of my high-level introduction to 3D modeling. So I've been working in the video game industry as a 3D artist since 1995, and I've been teaching game art since 2006. My primary role has been as an environment artist. And so I've done a lot of building inside of 3D, mostly inside of 3DSMax. And that's the primary piece of software we're going to use. Now, I don't always use that. I've used plenty of different pieces of software. And so the way I approach the class is the same way I approach my work, in that it's really important that you understand the basics. How do you get basic objects out there, and how do you move them around inside a 3D space? And so that's the first thing we're going to talk about. So in order to understand making objects, you got to understand the workspace you're in. So I like to start off with viewports. Every program has them in some shape or form. Here you're seeing two different examples. They're the two primary 3D packages out there. Over on the left, you have Maya, and over on the right, you have Max. Now, Maya is, I find, in my experience, that the larger the studio, the more likely they're going to be using Maya. Animators tend to prefer Maya. And over on the right, you have 3ds Max, which I find smaller studios using. I find that modelers tend to prefer 3ds Max. Now, there's other 3D modeling software out there. Blender has been on the rise for a number of years now. Many studios are starting to pick it up and utilize it more often. All packages are going to have some kind of 3D space that you're going to be working and navigating in. As another example, this is the Unreal Engine. For the purposes of my class, we'll be using Unreal later in the quarter. When you first start Unreal, you're going to only see one viewport. But the simple fact of the matter is that there's an option, as there is with any program, to change from one viewport to multiples. And again, you see you have a perspective view here, and then you see these two-dimensional views over on the side. Now, some packages do only have just one viewport. This is the third package we're going to be using this in the course of my class, and this is Substance Painter. What you're seeing here is a 3D viewport over on the left, and then on the right is what you're seeing is every surface of this model laid out in a two-dimensional view. This is what we utilize for texture mapping. That's creating the surfacing that goes onto a model. Now, this UV layout, as we call it, could be more efficient. Well, let's just get that out of the way for anybody that happens to be watching this video with more experience. This could definitely be a more efficient UV pack in here. But for the purposes of what I'm showing here for the demo, you have a 3D space that you navigate. There's a 2D space because this is a program geared towards surfacing an object, and the 2D space becomes really handy. And then you have all the assorted menus, just like the other software packages out there. So for us, we're going to be working in a package that has 3D and 2D space in it. So in the 3ds Max, you'll see that you're going to have two primary types of viewports. You have your perspective view, which has a vanishing point, and then you have your orthographic views. Orthographic means two-dimensional. The lines are perpendicular. They go directly away from the screen. That's why you don't see them. Now, you can change the orientation of, or which window is which. If you want your perspective in the top left, you can do that. If you want your front down here at the bottom right, you can do that as well. Those are interchangeable. But what is, I find, important, especially as you're learning, in order to keep yourself oriented, try to keep only one view as a perspective view and keep the rest of them two-dimensional, because it'll be good for you to reference those. Now, my understanding of how software got like this and how I like to think about it is that a lot of these 3D packages were created, they started off as CAD software, computer-aided drafting. Now that's for making things like blueprints. All right, here you go, you got a bunch of different examples of blueprints, right? You got planes, cars, guns, sci-fi stuff. Now, going through and creating blueprints like this, computer-aided drafting is very useful. You have all the different viewports, things where, and it's useful to be able to, for them when they're creating it, to be able to line up and make sure that their drawings line up. Now that works out really good for us as artists because we're able to utilize the two-dimensional views to put reference into our scenes. Now I've gone through, in standard practice, is if you have reference, good two-dimensional reference for a model, you can set it up so that it is oriented in each of the views for you to model to. In this case, here's two different sci-fi vehicles that I modeled. I set up the reference beforehand and then I started building them, and you can see the top, the front, and the right view that I have for each of these models. And you can zoom in and out. There's lots of controls for the viewports, but what does remain the same is the location of your reference relative to your actual model itself. And then you have your perspective view. As you're modeling, you have your perspective view to kind of get your overview and orient yourself on the object. Because really it's great to be able to go ahead and create a nice wheel shape, move it into position here on the side, adjust its position to line up in the front, and then double check to make sure on the top that it lines up as well. Now, I had mentioned before that the viewports, what their roles are, is interchangeable, and you can see here's a good example. Both of these models are in 3DSMax. The model on the right, the top right viewport is perspective. The one on the left, the bottom right is perspective. And other views are changed, like the front and the right are in different positions as well. So the fact that this software started off for computer-aided drafting, we're able to utilize that to our advantage to be able to model objects based off of reference, utilizing those different viewports. So how do you maneuver around inside of that 3D space? Now, there's a document that I'm going to share. It'll be posted on Google Classroom. It shows a number of shortcuts. Along with that, Autodesk does a very good job of documenting their software. Here I just clicked on it and it popped open the Autodesk area. This is access to all sorts of great quick videos that go through and talks about how you can navigate both with the mouse as well as using the buttons on your keyboard, right? And these will always be available to you via the software to get in there and work on it. Before I jump into the software, I did want to say that outside of viewports and understanding 3D space and how to manipulate it, where objects are oriented inside of it, is how do I get my raw material out there? How do you get the basic building blocks that you're going to use to make your complex objects? And so understanding in your software how you get that raw material out there is really important. Now, what you're seeing here, these are screenshots from 3DSMax, and they're actually from a couple years ago. Every year, Autodesk, who makes the software, goes ahead and updates it, and part of their updating it, they need to update a certain amount of it to justify the cost of you getting a new version every year. So one thing is they like to change the icons a lot. Now, even though the icons themselves change, their orientation and what they represent always remains the same. In this case, it's a bright starburst. Nowadays, it's like a little crosshair. This is create, and this is where we go through and create things. And so there's the ability to go in and create raw materials. Now, this is the default that you're seeing. I have a close-up here, and over here is a more accurate view of the entire panel. There's create, standard primitives. You can make all these basic objects: boxes, spheres, cylinders, cones, teapots. All right. So there's a number of different ways to go through and create them. There's just clicking the viewport to create them. There's also things like keyboard entry, which is what I like to use a lot to make sure that we're making our objects the proper size inside of our scenes. So with that in mind, let's take a look at 3DSMax. I've already launched it, and I created an object inside of here. This is a teapot. As it turns out, I did some research on it. You can research on why teapots. A lot of 3D software allows you to make a teapot. It has to do with the early days of generating software. Teapots are like a classic 3D thing. But I put it in here. It's nice because it actually has very specific different benchmarks on it as far as location, right? You create a teapot, you can see it has a front and a side, even though when you create it, it's oriented facing one specific direction. So let's take a look here. Down in the bottom right-hand viewport of your viewport, that's where you control your viewport controls. The bottom rightmost button is minimize and maximize. So that takes you from one view to the other. Now you see how there's this little yellow highlight? When I click, I minimize, maximize. You also notice when I clicked in negative space, my object is not selected, so you just see this kind of pink wireframe, we call it, and here's the full object. It highlights yellow when that means, hey, you can click on this because now it's selected. I'll be honest, as someone, a long-time user, I find this to be a very useless feature. So I've clicked on it, I made it active. When something's active, now they slap a silly blue highlight around it, but also now it's white, right? Everything is selected, right? It draws white that way in the orthographic, the two-dimensional views. If your model is really dark, you're having a hard time seeing it, you can just find the name in color and click on the color swatch, and you can select a different color to make it easier to see. So here I have my model, it's selected. I already showed you minimize, maximize. The view button to the left of that is orbit. And if I click inside of that circle, I can orbit in 3D. If I click outside of it, it just orbits two-dimensional. Just be careful, if you get into the 3D space, 3D takes over and it gets kind of wonky. If you just click on the little squares, you can just spin it around. I'm going to do something here where I'm going to change this perspective view to a front view and then change it back to perspective to kind of reset the view. And I'm not going to hit the bottommost button, I'm going to hit the one above it, which is Zoom Extents All. And that's going to zoom out in every viewport. If I use this magnifying glass, I can kind of zoom in or zoom out wherever I want. And if I just go back to that, not the bottom right, but the one above it, Zoom Extents All, that'll zoom in every viewport. There's other things. There's the hand. The hand allows you to pan. And then there's field of view and zoom. Probably your best bet for zooming in and out is just using the zoom button. Now all of these, once you're in there, if you want to get out of that mode, just right click and that'll take you out of it. If you right click on a model, you make it your context menu. Don't worry about that. Just click over in negative space. All right. And when I say negative space, I mean that's anywhere in the viewport, the actual viewport, that your model, your highlighted model is not in. All right. So then let's talk a little bit about these viewport controls. If I click here, this allows me to do things like maximize or restore. And I also, if I come up here, let's do this in the front, I can turn off the grid, turn it off here as well. And anytime you see a little letter next to something, that's the shortcut. So next to that is the ability to change your type of viewport, right? We can switch them in here. If these viewports if you ever decide to use the little view cube, see how it becomes orthographic. And if you want to get your front view back, just click and say front. Next to that, you have the display. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to set this to standard. You can switch any view to that. Oops. Oh yes, so that's the viewport type. That's the type of display it has. The next one after that, that viewport controls whether you're doing wireframe or if you're shaded. Shaded and wireframe. It's handy to know that F3 will toggle that on and off. And the last one I'm going to mention here is that clicking default shading and turning on edged faces is going to be really important because the sooner you start familiarizing yourself with the fact that these objects are made up of many, many little points floating in space, the quicker you're going to start to grasp the various concepts. So, all right, we kind of talked about the basics of navigating the viewport. Know that your mouse buttons will also allow you to have some control, but that there's always these buttons over here on the side. So let's take a look here. We start making objects. Now, the next thing is let's talk about making some objects. So here I have a teapot. I'm going to click and I'm going to scroll my middle mouse wheel to zoom out and hold it down to pan. I'm just going to come over here to create. And like I mentioned, the notes show a previous version of 3DSMax. All these tutorials that I'm going to be making these are the 2022 editions. So you'll be seeing it as the version you ideally have installed. So let's click here. I'm going to click on sphere. Spheres are easy because you just click and drag. And an object's going to be created based, its orientation inside of this three-dimensional world is going to be based on whichever viewport you make in it. Notice here, right, a sphere comes to a point at the end. And so you can see how the point is at the top when I made it in perspective, but when I made it in the front, it's facing the front. To get out of creation mode, you just right click. That will make this viewport active. Right click again, and then you get out of it. So now I made a couple of objects. Some objects take a little bit more control. If I click on box, I'm going to click and drag to define its footprint, the base. And then when I release, now I'm able to define its height. And when I click, I finish. So that's all clicking with the left mouse button. Right click to get out of there. So now I've gone in and I've created objects. You also, and this is something I'm going to do a lot for class, is I'm going to click on the names of these to expand or collapse them. That's something we'll be utilizing a lot because Max uses a lot of rollouts, and she'll be collapsing those to find the ones you want. I like to utilize keyboard entry, and so I'll just go in here, and I usually leave X, Y, and Z, that's your world location, at 0. I'll give it a value of, like, say, 50 and hit create. Now that made a sphere 50 with a radius of 50 units out here in the world. Let's just delete that one, though. How'd I delete it? I clicked on it, and, oops, still had sphere active, so it's going to make another one. I click on it, I hit delete. So now we kind of have some basic objects out here that we've created. If I zoom out, you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner of each of the viewports, you see this X, Y, and Z values. Those are their object's location inside, or actually what those are is those are showing you which axes you're seeing in front of you, right? And so Y is this direction. If you're looking in the top, Y is north-south, X is east and west, and then Z is going up into space and down to the center of the earth is how I like to describe it. Over here, you have this black center line crisscrossing to this center point in the world, which if I come up here and I click on the move icon and select on an object, you can see at the bottom its location in X, Y, and Z. This object that I use keyboard entry on, it exists at 0 in the world. It's centered in the world. This object here is actually offset. It's sitting in positive 86, positive 323, roughly. And this one is over in negative X. So you have your positive areas, right? And so this upper right quadrant, this is positive Y, positive X. This lower right quadrant is negative Y, but positive X. And over here, you have positive Y, but negative X. And you have negative X and negative Y, right? And so it's using those number systems. That's how these, grids kind of work. Z then is the same. Anything that's going up into space, that's positive. Anything going low, that's negative. So next, what I wanted to talk about is moving, right? How do we transform? How do we move stuff around in the world? And so there's a number of different controls for that. In this case, you can see over here on the left, I have this select option. There we go. I have select by name. I have the different selection options. And then this guy, which is usually you're going to want to keep it on here. I've never wanted to change this. This selects either region or box. That has to do with, do I want to be able to click in negative space and drag a region, and just if I get just a corner of something, it gets selected, or do I always have to select the whole thing? Never found a use for it. And then you have move, rotate, and scale. Now, you'll notice some of these things have little carrots in the corner, these little wedges in the corner. If you click and hold on them, you get different options. So the different selection types, there's multiples of those. Scale actually has multiple options. Anytime you click and hold, whatever you're currently on will be at the top, and then you see the three options. Scale is uniform, non-uniform, and squash and stretch. And each one of these different transforms changes the handle, right? This little thing you use to move it around, this is called a transform gizmo. It changes based on which tool you're using. So move just gives you these X, Y, and Z. If you hover, if you move your mouse over one axis, it's going to highlight it yellow, right? So in this case, you can click on just X and move it in just X, or you can grab kind of this handle and move it in two views, or grab just this square in the center, and that'll move it in every single one. Rotation, same way. If you hover, if you use just one axis, it's going to rotate it in just that one view, or in the center, move it around. And then same thing for scale. So let's take a look at that. Here I'm in move, and if I just grab the handle, or actually let's click in negative space. I'm going to come down here. I have nothing selected. I'm going to, not the bottom one, but the one above it. There we go. So now if I grab this and I move it just by this handle, notice how it just moves in that two-dimensional space. If I wanted to do the same thing here, I'm going to try and highlight Z. See how it's moving? In Z, it's going up and down. X, it's going left and right. But you don't really see it moving in Y, which is in the left viewport. If it was moving in Y, it would move, you wouldn't see it moving in the left view as much. So that's move. And again, I can constrain my actions based on the gizmo. If I go to rotate, I can click in negative space and just orbit anywhere. Going all the way around. And then we get to scale. Now, scale is great. You scale something up. You can grab a handle and scale it on a specific set of axes. Right. Grab it in the one axis, scale it just one direction. Now, you have uniform scale and non-uniform scale. If you're just using the gizmo, that doesn't really make much of a difference. Really what that'll give you access to is down here at the bottom if you want to change specific values. Like if you wanted to specifically say I want this thing to be half of its original size, you would type in a value of 50. And you can see now it's half its size. If I was in uniform, it wouldn't give me access to that value, right? It's certainly not going to change it back to what it was. It's just now any change I make is a uniform change, at least as far as typing values down below. And then the last one is squash and stretch, which means if I take something like a teapot and I go to scale it up, notice how it gets taller, but it also gets thinner because I'm squashing and stretching, just like the principle of animation. You could scale an object, but it's going to retain its overall mass. Just gets squashed out or stretched out, or I should say proportional. I'm probably not describing that right, and that's okay. Just squash and stretch. It's an animation thing. Now, the other tool would be the new guy, which I don't even have a slide for. And it's this one down the end. This is select in place. I'm going to take my teapot here, and I'm going to scale him down. Oops. Let's get out of squash and stretch to regular. And now I'm going to use select and place. I'm going to click on the teapot and move it over here, and you see in my different views what it's doing. It's placing my teapot on my model based on the surface of my model. So I can just drag it around, and it's going to place it on there based on the surface of any of these models. So that's select and place. So that's kind of like basic creation inside here in 3ds Max. It's kind of an introduction to a lot of these overall concepts.